Hello. Greetings to all from Justice for All, a non-governmental organization accredited with the UN's Department of Global Communications and working to promote human rights, prevent genocide, and to raise awareness regarding the persecution of minority communities. Our programs include Save Uyghur and Burma Task Force. My name is Adam Carroll, and this show is UN This Week. Speaking today, Thursday, July 16th, with the Executive Director of UN Association of the USA, Rachel Pittman. Today's topic, UN Under Fire. How can we save the United Nations at this time of crisis? As many at the UN can tell you, this is a challenging time, and not only because the doors of the UN building have been shut since March and are only now beginning to partially open to some staff. No one knows how the next several months will play out here in New York City, much less elsewhere. But this is already a time of crisis for multilateralism, the more or less cooperative leadership of a community of nations. While every day the United Nations is providing essential educational, peacekeeping, and humanitarian services around the world, the work is being politicized and blocked by some of the veto-holding powers in contradiction to basic principles in the UN Charter. Sad to say, in the name of sovereignty and nationalism, even smaller nations coordinate amongst themselves to block human rights protections. Authoritarianism and fake news are serious emerging trends. The work to promote and protect true UN principles of cooperation and service to humanity has perhaps never been more urgent. We are delighted to have as today's guest, Ms. Rachel Pittman. As Executive Director of UNA USA, she leads a grassroots advocacy movement of more than 20,000 Americans in over 225 chapters dedicated to supporting the UN in their communities, on campuses, and on Capitol Hill. UNA USA is a component of the United Nations Foundation, where she previously worked as Senior Director of Membership and Programs and also helped support new associations in China, Korea, Argentina, India, Peru, Egypt, and Mexico. Since World War II, through champions like Eleanor Roosevelt, Elliot Richardson, and Cyrus Vance, UNA USA and its chapters and divisions have built American support for the United Nations. In 1999, funded with Ted Turner's historic $1 billion gift, the United Nations Foundation Incorporated and Better World Fund, its sister organization, began a movement to support the United Nations and its causes. They encourage U.S. leadership to work constructively through the United Nations and encourages everyone to achieve the goals of the UN Charter, which just weeks ago celebrated its 75th anniversary. So thanks again, and sorry for a lengthy intro, but welcome. Yeah, and I know the UN Association from some of the local chapters here in New York, Southern New York. Margaret Shannon is very active. There's also Brooklyn Group. I know that Bruce Knotts, who was on this show only a couple of weeks ago, is involved. And I saw a UN Association condolences to the family of George Floyd. UN Association seems to be everywhere. And so I wanted just to start out really briefly about what is the difference first between UN Association and UN Foundation?
So, like you said, the UN Foundation was founded a little over 20 years ago. And the purpose of the foundation is to convene businesses, individuals, other NGOs to support the work of the UN. And also to provide funding for the UN through different projects. The United Nations Association, we joined the UN Foundation a little over 10 years ago, and we are a grassroots advocacy movement of Americans. So we are the grassroots arm that works with individuals in all 50 states, Puerto Rico, Washington, D.C., and Guam, to engage our communities about the work of the UN. So we are very domestic in our work, and the UN Foundation is global in their work.
Mm. Well, then, before we get into talking about the UN Association, I wanted to ask a bit about your experience, your previous experience with the foundation, especially with Mexico and China and all of these other places. It must be really challenging. Yeah.
So actually, that I think you may have read my resume in a different way. So I previously, before the foundation, worked for a lot of professional membership associations. And through that work, we engaged different countries in order to bring together professionals, be it scientists or lawyers or regulatory people. So that was my prior life before coming to the foundation. I came to the foundation about 5 years ago. I was brought on to be the director of membership for the United Nations Association of the USA, and then kind of climbed the ladder until last year was when I was promoted to be executive director of UNA USA. So I've always been with UNA USA within the foundation.
I see. And so just if we could have this on the screen, just an image of some of the different associations around the world, because really it's a very diverse global movement of UN associations. If we could have the logo up. And I think that each association probably includes a lot of different charters. Is that correct? I mean, chapters.
Yeah, so what everyone is looking at, as you said, are different United Nations associations. We are part of something called the World Federation of United Nations Associations. So there are well over 100 UNAs across the world, and they operate differently. Some have chapters within their countries. Some are funded by their national government, which we are not. So, which is really interesting because when we meet every 3 years or when we have our online conference calls, it gives us an opportunity to exchange the way that we operate, the way that we work with the citizens in our country to support the work of the UN. So we are a very eclectic group of UNAs that come together, but with the same purpose of supporting and educating and mobilizing people and inspiring them about the UN.
It was interesting to see on the website of the UNA China that a lot of the members were in the foreign ministry, where in most countries there wouldn't be that direct relationship with the government. It would be quite independent. So, as you said, everyone is different, and yet everyone is united in promoting the work of the UN, which needs support, obviously. When you're out in the community trying to interest groups and individuals in joining, in engaging, what kind of wrong ideas do you come across regarding the work of the UN?
That the UN isn't accessible to everyday individuals, that they cannot relate to the work of the United Nations, that they think that it's a legal binding organizations, meaning that countries have to, by law, abide by the resolutions and that come out of the United Nations. So what we do is try to educate them that it's not legal binding to countries, that there are ways that they can engage the UN through work like the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm happy to discuss, and that the work of the UN impacts everyone. Think about the mailing system, aviation, nowadays, especially with COVID-19, being able to bring together health organizations all across the world in order to find solutions and resources together. So we are all impacted by the great work of the UN. And I sometimes think people don't know that, but that's why UNAs exist.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the UN is indeed a bureaucracy, but so is every single government, and so I think UN can be unfairly maligned for its size and sometimes the way it may work. But there is a lot of talk about reform at the UN, maybe constant talk, and actually some action. Since you've gotten involved in this and you're just really immersed and really in the middle of it, what changes have you seen, especially positive changes?
The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, came in and said, I want to see parity across the UN system. And that is where you have equal male and female participation in working at the UN. And he achieved that at the executive level within the executive office of the UN, and it's something that is starting to trickle down into the other agencies, which I think has been incredible, especially as a woman, to know that he really values the input of women, and that as leaders, you know, we have perspectives that will make positive changes. So that is like one major reform that has happened at the UN, and there's been other work as well.
Have we ever had a female Secretary General?
Not yet.
That's next.
Came very close, but not yet. I'm sure that will happen. And his Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, which is, you know, the second highest level, has been a phenomenal leader. She actually spoke to UNA USA members on UN Charter Day as one of our programs. So he is definitely holding up to his promise of having parity at the UN.
Now, the role of civil society at the UN, it may differ in New York from Geneva, for example, but and civil society groups like to complain about shrinking space, and some of that is true. But as far as the important role of civil society groups, NGOs, religious groups, what have you, impacted communities, this seems to be becoming firmly entrenched. And I was wondering if you could speak to the UNA role in that.
Yeah, so for that, I mean, I think the UN has been welcoming to civil society through its major conferences, such as the Commission on the Status of Women, which we send a delegation to every single year. Last year, we had the UN Civil Society Conference, where they brought together NGOs from all over the world that were able to engage UN officials. So we, at any moment, will participate in those conferences, send delegations of our members to attend, and also to do readouts to our membership about what they learned, and help build our network by attending these conferences. So we want to meet with other NGOs and alongside UN officials so that we can have those conversations. So I think the United Nations has been good at bringing our voices to their conferences.
And UNA and other UNAs are involved with the Federation, the World Federation of UNAs, WAFUNA.
Yes.
And our group attends those meetings with Security Council presidents pretty much every month. There are a few nations that don't cooperate, but mostly they do, and it is good access, and it's well run, and it's really a very constructive role that WAFUNA plays with the other civil society groups. It's hard to get access to missions sometimes. You know, it takes a lot of calling if you have limited resources. It's difficult. Now, the UN does so many different things. There's peacekeeping, there's UN Security Council, there's the UN General Assembly, there's all the agencies, humanitarian, otherwise, and yeah, just so many. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak to that complexity a little bit, about some of the maybe unknown things that you guys were involved with in terms of promoting different capacities within the UN, maybe letting people know about them, opening doors, basically.
Yeah, and so one of the things that we try to do as UNA USA is to bring the UN closer to our members. We do that, right now we're doing it virtually. We created a program called the Global Engagement Online Series. People can go to our website to view past series, but bring UN officials to come in from different agencies to talk about what's going on. So recently we've had the UN Refugee Agency. We've had people from the International Labor Organization, just talking to us about how they are dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic and how they're responding to it, and trying to improve things on the ground. One thing that we just finished a program called Adopt the Future, and this is where we are working with the UN Refugee Agency to provide funding for refugees that are in the camps in Kenya, to make sure that they had the education support, from building schools to books to training teachers and so forth. So we were able to connect our members to the UN Refugee Agency, allowing them to give support, and also working with them to educate not only our members, but people in their communities about the refugee crisis, about how they can support resettled refugees here in the United States, in addition to providing funding opportunities for those refugee camps in Kenya. So that's just one example how we connect our members with UN agencies so they can learn more, but also to support them.
Maybe if we take a look at your website, we can take a look at how to navigate these different programs. I recall that the refugees were listed there. So this is your website, and if we were looking for refugees, would that be under Take Action?
Yes. So if you go to Take Action, and then you can, and Take Action, just to let you know, will give you an opportunity to take action by connecting with your members of Congress to say, we need to support climate action. We need to support the World Health Organization. There are a lot of different ways for you to communicate with our congressional members to say it's so important to have strong U.S. leadership at the UN. It's so important that we continue to give full U.S. funding for the UN so that their great work can continue. So that's what happens under Take Action. And you can also, if you go to refugees, could learn more about our Adopt a Future program, which is now going to become an affinity group, where people can still get together, even though we're not doing the fundraising side. We're allowing people to come together to talk about how they can support resettled refugees in their communities and how they can continue in their own way support the UN Refugee Agency. So yeah, so we usually put kind of the hot items that we're working on our homepage. Like I just said, we had the UN Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, speak. So you can click there and hear the conversation we had with her. And we just finished what was called, well, actually, we're not finished yet, but we're celebrating the UN's 75th anniversary. And we were doing consultations all across the US, which was part of a call by Secretary General Antonio Guterres, asking citizens around the world, how would you like the world to be the next 25 years? So we hosted consultations and gathered voices from all 50 states, Puerto Rico, and Washington, D.C. on how, as Americans, we want to see the world in the next 25 years. What are those critical issues that we think that we need to solve? So we completed that portion of it. in June. However, we're going to have people do it throughout the year, but we wanted to get that information to the UN, so that will be rolled up in their UN 75 Global Consultation Report at the UN General Assembly. So we gave them a big portion of it recently of what Americans thought about this idea of where we'll be the next 25 years, but people can still continue to give their input to the UN.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do see. I mean, our NGO is oriented towards human rights, and so sometimes we see, how humanitarian organizations that go to refugee camps may need to be very diplomatic and quiet about problems they see in order to remain there and not be kicked out. I mean, we saw that in Burma, for example, where NGOs were kicked out for being critical of abuses. And not just UN agencies, but Doctors Without Borders and the like. So I think that there is a balancing act between humanitarian and human rights, though maybe it's better to say that they're complementary, and that we need both, absolutely. And we need them to be coordinated so that there's communication amongst the groups, so that if Red Cross or another group sees some problem, they can flag it to Amnesty International or to a smaller group like ours. And if there's a humanitarian need, human rights defenders can also flag that. So building up a community that communicates well is really essential. Again, last time with another guest, we were talking about silos, and that we're trying to break open the silos and really have a collective space for action. Yeah. Some of the governments are more accessible than others, of course. And of course, most of our viewers probably will be in the United States and are somewhat aware that the US government, this administration, has taken a rather hostile view of the UN. Other nations, frankly, have not done too well either. You see Russia's veto of many important human rights resolutions in the Security Council regarding Syria. I mean, really rather discouraging. And other examples come to mind as well. So in terms of dealing with governments that are really not embracing the UN, one hopes to outlast this trend. But is there a way that through education and through its advocacy that the UNA, wherever it may be, can push back against that?
Yeah, I think that we do that through all of our advocacy work. As you said, we do education within our communities, but most importantly, at least in the US, it's for us to do outreach to our members of Congress who are the ones who are allocating funds to the UN, and to talk about why the UN matters to me. As your constituent, this is why I believe that you need to support the UN. So it's so important. People sometimes think, what can I do? And what you can do is, when we make it easy for you, is to go to UNA USA and take one of our actions. We make it easy for you to call your members of Congress, their office. We help you set up meetings so that you can have either online. We did virtual meetings a couple weeks ago for our week of action, and meet with either a member of Congress or the staff member of Congress to talk about these issues and how they affect you, not only locally, but also how it builds up to a global issue. And the UN is the organization that can help solve these problems.
And since the UNA USA is so large with so many chapters and diverse, I think that probably the door's open on Capitol Hill largely, and that you can get those meetings. I understand next week you've got a week of action with Motivation Monday, Tweet Storm Tuesday, Wisdom Wednesday, and so forth. I was wondering if you could...
We just completed that.
Yeah.
Yeah. We did do a week of action. Typically, it would be our our lobby day where we would bring members from all over the US to Washington, D.C. to meet with their members of Congress up on Capitol Hill. But of course, we are all social distancing and some people working from home, so we did it online. And we worked with our members to set up virtual meetings with the offices of members of Congress. We took the whole week, though, to say it's not going to be just one day. Some days we had tweet storms. Other days we encouraged our members. We did a call-in day where we gave them a platform to make it easy for them to be connected with the offices. So it was a full week. We did have a couple trickle past the week between the 20th and the 26th. So I did actually have a meeting this week with my members and their member from Delaware, for example. So in a way, you're kind of right. They're still kind of having a few more, but the majority of them happened the other week, and it ended on UN Charter Day, which was really nice on June 26th.
That makes sense. I see in my inbox a message from Margaret Shannon from a local UNA chapter asking me to help set up a meeting with AOC. And unfortunately, apparently I didn't do it. We did one meeting last year with her staff. But,
Great.
But
this is not just a one-time thing.
Yes,
we work with our members. So during recess, so when members of Congress go back home, to take some time off, we do what's called in-district meetings because they have offices in their districts. So we work with our chapters to put together a group of members, of constituents, and have those meetings during recess time. So in August, we will be working with our chapters to set up more meetings so that they can continue to talk about the United Nations.
Good. And it's good to know that support for the UN is bipartisan. Not necessarily everyone, but there are ex-Peace Corps volunteers or returned Peace Corps volunteers from both sides of the aisle, and people who have traveled and who just get, that international relations are really important.
Yeah,
and that we're not a fortress. Yeah.
One thing that I just want to bring up is that in 2015, the 193 member states agreed on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and this is a to-do list of what needs to occur to build a stronger world by 2030. And so what's so fascinating about the Sustainable Development Goals is that it's not just for the 193 nations to achieve, it's for all of us. It's for on a local level to a global level. And these 17 Sustainable Development Goals includes things like gender equality, eliminating poverty, eliminating the lack of education. There's 17 goals. So what we do at UNA USA is connect individuals with these goals so that they can find a way how they can get involved and advance the goals. And we're in our last 10 years and there's a lot of work to do. So I'm hoping that people can look into these sustainable development goals and figure out how they too can take action and support this cause.
Well, if we fail to uphold these goals, we may destroy the planet. So they're really essential, and we really should be feeling some urgency about them. So that is part of the education, is not letting people be confused by or intimidated by 17 goals, but really get into how they work together. And I've seen people's eyes light up talking about the goals. Maybe having little pins on their lapels help, but it's definitely important at the UN, and also making sure that countries pay their dues, which some, unfortunately, like the United States, do not fully pay their dues, and that weakens this whole enterprise. It hollows it out. We're going to pause just for a second for station identification, and we are a show of justiceforall.org, and this show is called UN This Week. So that pause reminds me that I meant to ask you about your trip to Bangladesh, because you mentioned the work that UNA is doing to raise awareness about the refugee crisis. But you yourself have visited the Rohingya refugee camps. I was wondering if you could say something about that.
Yeah, so in 2018, I went on a learning trip. And it was a learning trip where we take staff of Congress so that they can understand how US funding has helped the refugee crisis with the Rohingyas. We visited Cox's Bazar. We talked with government officials, so we were able to talk to the host country and how they are supporting the Rohingyas. And we got to spend a lot of time with the families that had to flee Burma and had to, all the atrocities that happened to them, and were able to sit and have, small conversations, like one-on-one, or just a small group. It wasn't a big group of us because it's, a very tragic situation. And they opened up and they told their stories of fleeing and seeing their loved ones massacred. And it was a very emotional trip. But we also got to see the UN in action. We got to see how the different agencies work together, between the UN Refugee Agency to the UN UNFPA to the World Food Program, and also how they worked with NGOs that were there on the ground supporting the Rohingyas. So it was very eye-opening, very moving, but you left wanting to do more advocacy for on the refugee crisis. The group went back left saying, I'm going to talk to my boss, the member of Congress, saying we have to continue to fund. So these trips are so important to be able to educate those that have an impact on the work that the UN does, and an impact on the funding, the impact on the future lives of these individuals. So it was a good trip,
Yeah. Well, it's unfortunate that the average number of years that refugees stay in the camps around the world is 17, which seems horrific to consider. That's somebody's 2 generations almost, growing up there. And I think some groups like Palestinians and maybe Somalis, have been in their camps for a long time, and we certainly hope that that won't be the case for the Rohingya. Obviously, Burma doesn't really want to take them back and give them their rights or their villages back. But there, at least we have the international courts and all the pressure of the UN mechanisms. And so we hope that eventually the Burmese government will realize that it's not hurting anyone to embrace pluralism and to take them back.
It's so important that we continue to tell their story, because I think the hard part is if it's not in the news, people forget. So we have to find ways, and that's what we do at UNA USA when we have our global engagement online series programs, or one day hopefully we'll get back to face-to-face. We work to bring people who are resettled refugees along with someone from the UN Refugee Agency, bringing them together so that they can tell their stories and inform people and keep them alive, keep those stories alive, because it's still going on. It's getting worse. Right. We just have to continue to speak up.
Right. And unfortunately, both in Burma, Rakhine State, and in the camps in Bangladesh, they're isolated and they don't have access to internet. And now, of course, there's threat of COVID-19, which so far has only been a threat. It hasn't killed scores and hundreds, but that certainly could happen, as we've all seen elsewhere. So there's a big concern about the lack of internet service being allowed them, and that's affected any possibility of education for the children. So there's a lot of concerns. Now, in terms of education of various communities about the UN, about how one could engage, I understand that the Model UN program isn't owned just by UNA or any one organization, but that you all have been involved in similar and related projects. So here it is on your website. I was wondering if you could speak about that, because I think a lot of people going to school hear about Model UN and maybe even participate.
Yeah, and a lot of people think that the United Nations Association of the USA owns Model UN, like you said. So we do get a lot of calls. We used to do Model UN conferences years ago, but we transitioned into online platforms. We feel that we have a larger reach if we do it online. So we have this new program called My Diplomat, that you can use from the palms of your hand on your phone, or you can go and use your laptop or iPad or something like that. But it gives you an opportunity to learn what's it like to be a diplomat, to learn more about policy issues that people have to negotiate around, and not only learn, but get hands-on where you pretend like you're doing it yourself. I mean, that's the most important thing, where you bring together your peers and you assign yourself different countries, and you become a diplomat online. And our chapters, though, we do have several chapters that do Model UN conferences. So even though the national level does not host them, we do have chapters around the US that will work with their local high schools and middle schools to run Model UN conferences, as well as colleges. We have campus chapters that do it. And then we provide just other resources that you can tap into if you're interested in Model UN. We have a lot of people that kind of transition out of Model UN into we have Model UN students who are UNA members, but we also have those who are older, who, that was their first step into UNA USA, was they, had experiences with Model UN, but they wanted to continue with doing things around the United Nations, and UNA USA is the best way to do that. And now they get to advocate for the UN.
No, that's a great resource. And I was wondering, do other UN associations around the world, do they also get involved with the Model UN program? I mean, for example, in Pakistan? Yeah.
A lot of them get involved with Model UN within their own countries.
Yeah, I would think that experience of diplomacy and consensus building and mediation and what have you is very useful, especially for a young person looking for a better way.
Yeah, and we provide other opportunities, because the idea about Model UN and My Diplomat is to learn how to also be a leader. So we provide leadership opportunities. We have partnerships with organizations like Interview, where people can track their service programs, and it aligns with the Sustainable Development Goals. So we offer, different ways and fellowships that people can participate in to learn how to be a leader. I mean, ultimately, that's what we want.
Mm-hmm. Well, so in other words, people can go to the website, and if they want to get involved directly with UNA, what should they do?
First, they should join. And by the way, if you're under the age of 26, it's free for you to join. So please know about that. And then if they have a chapter near them, that's the most important thing. We have campus chapters on colleges and universities, some high schools. and then as well as community chapters. And if they don't belong to one, it's okay, because we have a lot of programming throughout the year to engage them in ways to advocate for the UN. So once you sign up, we'll work with you on different actions that you can take to get involved.
Well, before we end, I was wondering if I could ask you a personal question about how you came to this, because you're very much involved in all of this UN work. And I was wondering, did you grow up in a diplomat's family, or did you become radicalized by a film, or who knows what, but
I think you have all these things that happen to your life that brings you to a moment. So for me, I felt like a diplomat because my parents were educators. My dad retired as a college president, so we moved around as his career advanced. I lived on Long Island, in Baltimore, in Memphis, Tennessee, went back to Long Island, and then went to college in Washington, D.C. So I felt like a diplomat because I moved around a lot. And that's one thing. But throughout my life, I was always attracted to people of different cultures. In Baltimore, a Black family. We lived in a majority Jewish neighborhood. In Memphis, it was very segregated. So I had a hard time with that, but I found my community that did diversity training. So there was a group that I joined that did cross-cultural and diversity training. And then with my career, even though it started off with more of the traditional association world, I was engaged in a lot of international programming where we brought those members to different countries so that they can do some exchanges and best practices. So I was very much involved in all those countries that you had mentioned at the beginning of this program. So it just, for some reason, I found UNA USA. I was a perfect fit for the job. And now I feel like I'm at home. Now I feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be, working on these issues, working with like-minded individuals that want to have a better world. And it just worked out really well for me.
Well, it sounds like it, and I hope that we can, continue to build bridges instead of walls. And if you want to build a bridge, you have to really dig deep, for good foundations, and you're doing that. So I wanted to thank you, and we have to finish now at the end of this edition. Next week we have a speaker who will speak about Hong Kong and some of the challenges there. And until next Tuesday, we'll sign off. This is Adam Carroll from Justice for All. Thank you so much, Rachel Pittman.
Thank you.
And very inspiring, and looking forward. Till next time.